Afternoon, colleagues and friends of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Thank you so much for being with us here today. My name is Smear Hendricks, and I'm the Acting Dialogue and Advocacy Manager at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. This is a really important engagement with a dialogue entitled Public Solidarity Towards Radical Reform. Now, in order to welcome you appropriately to this engagement, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Mr. Sello Hatang. Over to you, Mr. Hatang.
Thank you very much, Sumay, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a stimulating and important dialogue. We're really looking forward to engaging with you and at least fielding some of the questions that you'd have. Our theme today invites us to address simultaneously a more theoretical or strategic question and to reflect on the learnings of what unfolded in South Africa during July. As the Foundation has said on a number of occasions previously, in relations to the latter, horrible as the loss of life and property was, dismal as the failures of intelligence and quick security response were, scary as the moment was for our constitutional democracy. Nonetheless, we saw something extraordinary emerge, which could be fundamental to the task which lies ahead for our country. On the ground, in so many locations, community members stood up and demonstrated the kind of leadership we so often lack in the higher strata of polity and society. They made peace. They supported law enforcement in protecting infrastructure. They cleaned up, and they are supporting relief and rebuilding efforts. I've personally visited many of the sites of public violence in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal and have been moved by the extraordinary creative energy to be found in the midst of desolation. And I have been inspired again and again by the demonstration of solidarity as the private sector works with the state and with civil society in confronting what is an enormous challenge. Our collaboration with I think it's important that I pause and just reflect on some of the people that have made a huge impact in terms of this kind of stopping the violence and ensuring that they show leadership where it was lacking. I want to reflect on one person by name, Remolo Sangwe, for example, in Mahikeng, who in the midst of everything, he stopped the community and said, not in our name will it happen that this happens. We should stop this from happening in our community because it will take us back many, many years. So our collaboration with the IDC, Hulamin, NASPAS, OSF, SACC, and the South African Human Rights Commission sees us this week in KZN. So we'll be going to KZN for a few days this week to also engage with people beyond just giving relief, but to show that solidarity in action. So sincere collaboration can take us very far as a nation. What we get right in rising to the challenge of disaster or crisis or catastrophe is what we have to learn to get right on a continuing routine basis. What the Foundation has been calling social bonding is going to be vital if we are to succeed in building the country of Madiba's dreams, but the country of our children's dreams too. We know that it can be done. We know that civil society can work together with the private and public sectors in solidarity in order both to defend and to deepen democracy. In the Foundation's work in early childhood development, for example, over the last 3 or 4 years, it is precisely this form of solidarity and the social bonding it enables, which has seen significant strides being made in ensuring that the thousands of ECD centers which have been left behind are identified, empowered, and supported. So today's dialogue, in our view, is positioned perfectly to address critical questions being posed to our society right now. And it also provides a springboard into the themes which will be explored during the 19th Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture next week. The rule of law and sustainable development are unimaginable without the kinds of solidarity and cross-sectoral endeavor which we will be hearing of today. Please join us next week to listen to the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Me Fatou Bensouda. I have no doubt that our panelists today will give us much food for thought and will deepen our lines of inquiry. A big thank you to Me Gloria Serobe, who must be very impressed that I used solidarity so many times in this speech, intentionally to impress you and to make you very happy to participate here today. I want to thank our dear friend Yasin Teba. Thank you so much for always just opening your door when we knock, asking for help. Ntate David Harrison, thanks again for supporting our work the way you have been supporting it. And I'm very grateful to our friend, our dear friend, who will actually be hosting the lecture next week, Aus Luando Klaso of the Constitutional Hill Trust, for agreeing to facilitate the conversation today, and of course, for doing so again next week. I want to thank the team at the Nelson Mandela Foundation for doing such a sterling job to put this together. And finally, thanks to everybody who has made the time to join us today. Over to you, Sumaya, as you then lead us on this very stimulating dialogue.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hatang. What you spoke to, solidarity in action, I think it's going to be a recurring theme throughout today's engagement. Just in terms of the structure, so people know what to expect, we're going to be having short inputs from each of our three panelists. This will then be followed by an engagement between the moderator, who will then open it up to the audience for further engagement. So as our CEO has mentioned, we're really grateful to have Lwando Tlaso, who is our moderator today. She is a writer and a lawyer and the founder of Including Society. As I had said, she is going to be opening it up for engagement. So in the chat function on the platform where you are joining us from, or if you're watching on any of our other platforms, please ask questions. And if there's any comments you'd like to give as well, if there's any particular person you would like to direct those questions to, please feel free to tell us. We really want to make sure that this afternoon, as much as we are on this digital platform, that we can form a community here this afternoon. Just want to briefly introduce our panelists. So we have Gloria Serobe. She is the chairman of the Solidarity Response Fund, which for many of you will know was formed last year in response to the president's call for support and solidarity in the wake of COVID-19. We have Dr. David Harrison, who's from the who's the CEO of the DGMT Trust, which focuses on education, on early childhood development, as well as youth development for innovation. And last but not least, we also have Yasin Teba, who is the director of Vision Tactical and also the chairman of the Muslim Association of South Africa, which has been involved in a number of initiatives, both provincially and with local government around COVID-19. So with that said, my role here is done. I'm now going to hand over to our very capable moderator, Lwando, who will be leading us for the rest of this discussion. Over to you, Lwando.
Thank you, Sumaya. Thank you to your team. Thank you to the NMF, and thank you to our panelists for being present, for being prepared, and for your contributions, which I predict will be so insightful. Just to the audience, I have asked for permission to relinquish with titles and formalities and to refer to the panelists by their first names, which they've all agreed. And for parity and equality, I'm going to go by alphabetical order in terms of first names, which means the first panelist to open up our discussion with their opening remarks is Gloria. Over to you. And then we'll have David and then Yassine.
Thank you very much, Luando. Thank you, Silo. Thanks, Maya. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with the Nelson Mandela Foundation. He just always has to remind us of where we come from and how to maintain some of his legacies where we can. I have gone through your concept document in terms of what you want us to talk about today, very much around socio-economic justice issues, in terms of how do we mesh what the politics have got to do as government in terms of structural reform for the country, but who are we as a civil society, as non-governmental organizations, as private sector, what is our role in this? It's a topic that I like because the benefit of being 62 years old, Luando, is that I have lived an adult life pre-Mandela time. 50% of that was pre-Mandela time and 50% of that is in this new South Africa. So I speak with some kind of authority about what was there because I lived it as an adult. And I can match and reconcile what needs to be here and now, because it helps a lot when it comes to these kinds of debates, because it moves you from theory, you feel it's in your body system. Remember now that apartheid truly thrived on deprivation of all the things. It truly thrived on deprivation, deprive people of education, deprive people of critical things like land, deprive them of just about anything that's very important. That is how it thrived. But secondly, they put their best brains to monitor this program. The most clever of that system were used to make sure that these things are well implemented, well executed. I always say it's the most sophisticated system I've ever seen in terms of monitoring and executing. And so the results did show quite visibly, because today what we're still dealing with is the systemic issues that come from that. What is important here, though, is that for any reform to make sense in South Africa, because we are trying to untie those knots, and they are very tightly done. To untie those knots, we need your best brains as well in the country, because you are undoing a very sophisticated, well-planned, well-systematic kind of process over years. And so we can't be casual about this and not look at it in that context. But quickly, starting last year, we face another pandemic, because I do call apartheid a pandemic. We get to be faced by another pandemic last year, which is COVID. A different kind of system altogether, quite faceless. And this one also thrived on isolating the victim. People die alone, people get sick alone, they are all by themselves. The trauma of this whole thing is very difficult to imagine. And so our response to COVID had also got to take that into account. And then, as if that is not enough, because we are still dealing with that kind of program, poor scientists have doing their best to bring in the vaccination into it, and hopefully it reduces the stress in the system, and we have to respect that. As if that's not enough, we then have the July events, as Silo says. This now also thrives on something else, just as evil as well. It thrives on isolating people, cutting them off from all sorts of things. When you hear the horror stories of these places that people cannot get access to their chronic medicines and all of that, never mind just putting food on the table, people's lives have just been distracted in a way that one cannot believe. And I want to actually stop there and say, I would rather deal with the question and answers on this matter, because to me, they are all similar programs, very desperately trying to destroy people, and in a very programmatic way. And all of them, at least the apartheid system, I can say, with all the brains in the world. And South Africa has got to put all the brains in the world to undo all of that. Just a last point. If we do manage to undo most of that, which is a pre-President Mandela time, all the structural reforms we're looking at, if we do the right things on agriculture, if we do things on, it would mean that some of the pandemics that come must find us more sustainable and resilient if we do it right. Remember now, government on its own has done its best, over 1,000 pieces of legislation to change things. Some of the things we have to do don't need legislation. And South Africans, in a solidarity way, which they always give, we can actually do the best to actually change that system, such that if we are faced by another kind of pandemic, as I say, COVID or the July events and all of that, they must find people resilient and that they can stand on their own, as opposed to the desperation that we see today. Let me end there, Lwando. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gloria. And as a lawyer, I tend to agree with you that we possibly are good on the legislation side, some of the most progressive laws in the world. Something else is needed, and hopefully through this discussion, we'll be able to articulate what that is. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to have been invited to participate, and I'm very glad to be here. I think we need to ask ourselves why the events of July shook us to the core. It's not as if there were not rumblings of discontent that have been with us, that arose through the days of apartheid and have been sustained over the last 27, 28 years. Clearly, the vision of Tata Mandela has not been fully realized, and so I really appreciated the way in which the call to us was framed, the brief to us was framed, which is to think radically in the sense of getting right to the roots of the problem. What is it that we have not got to the roots of? What is it that we're just touching on the margins, that if we don't address, in fact, we're just going to continue down the road, and we can expect sporadic explosions as the ones we've seen in the past month. So I'd like to just present to you just some thoughts on a presentation, and so I'm going to start to share my screen, if I may. And I trust it's visible. Thank you. And my thesis is that what we need now is a radical redistribution of hope. And as we've heard, and as you all know, this is not news to anybody, I'm sure, that 10% of South Africans own 90 to 95% of the measurable wealth in South Africa. What we don't hear that often is that 50% of people in South Africa own none of the measurable wealth. This is a pattern that is exactly the consequence of the legacy of apartheid, but it hasn't changed. And I think we need to accept that finance-based empowerment strategies to redistribute wealth have not made much of a dent, certainly not in changing that income distribution. And we need to ask why. And there's some things that we know and we can explain in conventional economic terms. We know from the work of Thomas Piketty that when the rate of return to wealth, in other words, when people have money and they earn interest on that, when that rate is greater than the rate of economic growth, then inequality gets worse. And that's what we've seen in South Africa. We have seen productivity growth over the last 27 years, but it's been bifurcated. It's happened in, most of the productivity growth has happened in the skilled sectors. There has not been much growth in the sectors that use low-skilled labor, and we certainly have not generated greater employment. And the consequence of this, and it's well known, is that the returns have been captured by the skilled minority. They've largely held on to onto the wealth, and so patterns of wealth distribution continue. That 50% at the bottom that are unemployed or unskilled simply have no mechanism of generating wealth. That much we know, and we have to confront this honestly and find ways to address it. There are also things that we know and we've spoken about, but we actually struggle to explain and we struggle to respond to. We certainly don't know how to translate these issues in a language that is easy to put into the hands of policymakers to convince Treasury that money needs to be spent. And I'd like to refer to them as the hard, soft aspects of social transformation. The things that we've been speaking about now, the vicious cycle of social alienation that leads to risk tolerance and risk-taking, the entitlement of wealth that we can't seem to get over, and the corruption that's associated with it, the inertia and the indifference and the apathy that stems from a persistent sense of marginalization and exclusion. And so the question that has been put to us is, how do we relate these difficult and seemingly abstract concepts of solidarity, of justice, and of hope? And I think Sumaya put it well in the brief to us, saying that often it seems that solidarity and justice tug in opposite directions, and hope can be awfully fluffy and doesn't seem to fit into any sort of economic model. So how do we use these concepts that are so important, that we believe are fundamental to the successful transformation of South Africa? How do we harness them in a way that they can become instruments of change, of radical reform? And I don't have the answer, but I've certainly benefited from the work and the insights from both empiricists and some theoretical work that has tried to understand how these factors result in societal tolerance of risk, of personal hazards, the hazards of personal risk-taking that often drives HIV infection higher in informal settlements, crime and corruption, alcohol and drug abuse, looting, xenophobia. And I have found, and in my work that I did as the head of Love Life HIV prevention program among young people for 10 years, find it really useful to use this basic framework that Mary Thompson, an anthropologist, Wildavsky and Ellis put together in the early 90s. And they maintain that there are only two main factors that drive risk tolerance. And they are social solidarity and whether people perceive that they have choice in their life. And where social solidarity is low and where perceptions of choice are low, people tend to be fatalistic and they seem to be willing to put themselves at risk. Where there's a high degree of social solidarity and where perceptions of choice are high because those perceptions are real, then one tends to develop a more egalitarian society and people start to eschew the risks that I have spoken about. This is very helpful because it tells us that it points at least to the importance and the way in which we can harness concepts like social solidarity to try and reduce risk tolerance. Perceptions of choice can only come about if those perceptions are real. And the other graph, and I promise you this is the last that I want to show you, but just really interesting work done by behavioral economists Lowenstein and Prelick, trying to understand the choices that people make the further they look into the future. And what they've found is that this, what's called the utility curve, is hyperbolic. In other words, what it means is that people who look far into the future do place value on their health, do place value on social security and on societal well-being. Yet, what influences the decisions they make on a day-to-day basis is shaped by the fact that that value is heavily discounted in the present. And we can think about it when we think about the looters. Many of those looters who were interviewed have a strong sense of aspiration. They have dreams. They want to be part of a society. Their utility for life down the line in 5 years' time is real. People ask, why is it that looters would go and loot shops when they know, and burn down shops when they know that their community is going to be damaged? Well, if we understand this graph, if we understand that what influences people's decisions is whether they feel that tomorrow is going to be better for them, not whether life will be better in 5 years' time, then we begin to understand some of these dynamics in terms that make psychological sense. And so we have to build a sense of real, as I said, but also imminent possibility, real and imminent possibility in the lives of people in South Africa. And I would argue that provides us with a framing to use hope as an instrument of change. Our job is to create a sense of real and imminent possibility in life. And that comes if we agree with the framing of Wildavsky, Thompson, and Ellis. It comes through a progressive scaffolding of social solidarity and expansion of choice as people are able to participate both in society and the economy. And so if we're aiming for social justice, it's not simply finding ways to distribute money to people. It is finding a way to distribute hope, where that hope is defined as a sense of real and imminent possibility. And so now if we think about the type of radical agenda that is needed in South Africa to distribute and redistribute real and imminent possibility, the point is here that we have to go back to the building block, the basic building blocks of our society. If we're going to scaffold real and imminent possibility, we can't do that simply by providing financing at tertiary education level. We can't do it simply by throwing even additional money or relief grant at people who have been affected by the looting or affected by COVID. We have to have a longer term agenda. We have to start bottom up and build the scaffolding of human development. And the first is that we need children in our society who are loved and not hurt, who have enough food, who are able to learn, and then can participate in nurturing education and vocational skills and ultimately into the world of work. But it's this basic scaffolding ultimately that is going to set the tone both for the returns to their investment in further education, but also to their contribution to society. Only when that is in place will we build the societal and personal agency that drives economic and societal productivity and ultimately results in a more stable society. And so what is our challenge and what can we do now? Well, I think the first thing we have to admit is that those first three rungs of the ladder are broken, remain broken. Our children, many of our children are not loved, or they may be loved, but they're still in hurtful situations. They don't have enough food. They aren't able to learn, develop the basic capability that enables them to learn when they go to school. The structural fractures that Sumaya spoke about are still there. And I'd like to mention three of them because I believe that there are three where intervention can be done over the course of the next 3 years. Not only can, but must be done. The liquor industry in South Africa has a business model that is built on heavy drinking, especially in poorer communities. And that is a model that commenced during apartheid, when the liquor industry was hugely supportive both of apartheid and where the profits of the liquor industry were used to build the Bantustans. There has to be a fundamental addressing. This is not about individual responsibility, a fundamental addressing of the structural factors in the liquor industry, the way that it's structured, that are perpetuating heavy drinking. And I just give one example, the dumping of very cheap liquor into poor communities that can't be sold overseas. The net cost to our society, and I'm putting it in economic terms, social terms aside, the net cost has been calculated at between 10 and 12% of GDP. The second legacy of apartheid that hasn't changed is the highly concentrated food market. And where one has that in a highly rapidly urbanizing context, when people are moved off the land or people move into informal settlements where cash is king. Here, this toxic mix of high prices, high profits in such a concentrated market, high profits that are effectively subsidized through the social security system that we put in place. Let's not forget that. Results in over a quarter of our children under the age of 5 being stunted. And finally, early learning, which is so critical to generate the returns for the rest of our investment in education. Yet early learning is the neglected orphan of education in South Africa. It only gets 1.5% of public funding for education, despite the fact that early learning generates the highest returns in an investment portfolio in education. So what do we need to do now? Well, and I'm getting practical, I'm getting radical, but this is what is required. We need a package of legislation that is aimed at curbing heavy drinking, not at banning alcohol, not at curbing the rights of people that are moderate drinkers, but we know from across the world that there are best buys that can curb heavy drinking and can have a profound effect on whether our children are hurt, whether women in our community are damaged. And that is an advertising ban at the point of sale, introduction of a minimum unit pricing, so we can stop dumping of alcohol into our poor communities, reducing availability, 5-liter containers, 1-liter beer containers, that must stop. Opening hours need to be curtailed, and a reduction in the blood alcohol content. Secondly, because we have a situation where people are dependent on shops, and because we have such a concentrated food market, we have to introduce a basic basket of highly nutritious foods that are available to people. We have to prevent our children from being stunted, because that stunts our economy, not only for now, but for the next 20 to 30 years. And that can be achieved. We know what those foods are. Those basic foods, the price of them can be halved by zero markup by manufacturers and retailers, managed by an equal public subsidy. There are many people in South Africa that don't have access to social security. Foreign nationals, people without IDs, we know that. Even as we're talking about basic income grant, food affordability is a major issue, and we have to have a targeted strategy for dealing with it. And then lastly, we know that money seems to be available, and maybe it's not available, but money is found when we're in crisis, when there is a need to address some of the immediate issues that arise. Well, an immediate crisis in South Africa is the fact that our children are not getting the early learning that they require. And we have to treble our investment in early learning over the next 3 years, and that will require an additional 10 million rand. 10 million rand, people will say we don't have. Well, it's a matter of priority. It's a matter of radical reform to address some of these structural underpinnings. Isocrates, writing to Demodocus, right back in 374 BCE, said the one thing that the just have over the unjust is that they surpass them in their high hopes. My hope is that we use the next 3 years to ensure that there's a radical redistribution of real and imminent possibility to people right across our country, so that we can start to work towards a socially just and right community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And to those who are joining us, we are just hearing the panelists' opening remarks. We've heard Gloria, we've heard David, and we're about to hear Yassine. And I'd like to encourage you all to say hello, make your presence felt in the room. Let us know that you're there, and more importantly, ask us questions, and ask the panelists questions. And please, any insights, comments that you have on what has been said thus far is more than welcome. Yassine, over to you. And David, thank you for that. I mean, I feel like we are a country that was founded on hope. You know, our country was synonymous to the word hope. And for a country as young as ours to feel the sense of hopelessness that we have felt is quite something to remark on, whether people will trust hope again. But I think in the way that you've defined it and based on prior learnings, maybe there is room there for recapturing the importance of hope and social solidarity. Yassine, over to you.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you to the staff at the Nelson Mandela Foundation for arranging this dialogue. I think it's important that we engage and introspect once again on some of the challenges that we faced. And I call it challenges for a number of reasons, which I'll give a little later. My name is Yassine Teba, and I'm the chairman of the Muslim Association of South Africa. We were very, very involved in a number of interventions over the past few months when we were hit with COVID in South Africa. We knew that the challenges in South Africa would be completely different to the challenges that we saw all over the world. Through the lockdown, we knew that the food crisis will hit South Africa very, very hard. We knew that we would be looking at a reflection of the inequality, the poverty, the hunger in the country. And we knew that we need to mobilize and work at interventions to take communities through this lockdown period. We also got involved in the second wave, supporting healthcare workers, supporting people at home, people that we knew couldn't get to hospitals or couldn't afford hospitals or couldn't, or were generally just afraid of COVID. And with that, we basically mobilized a number of doctors, nurses, medics, so that we were able to treat people. And of course, with the third wave and the vaccine finally in South Africa, we came up with a number of interventions on getting people and creating an awareness, firstly, for vaccination and getting people to vaccinate as quick as possible and basically making vaccines accessible to people. And that's what we concentrated on. But one thing I must add is that through, and judging from the previous speaker's comments, the parallels that they've drawn with apartheid and some of the challenges that we've gone through, not just with COVID, but with the protests as well. I'm happy they draw their parallels because South Africa has overcome apartheid and we latch onto that every time we go through a challenge. Every time there's a violence like the protests, we latch onto the fact that South Africa can mobilize and we can show our spirit of Ubuntu and we can come together and overcome the challenge again. But I'm happy that we hold on to that. It's just a matter of to what point will that pressure pot burst? And we keep on seeing these protests and this pressure just being released, but we know that we're dealing with a lot more. We're dealing with systems that are crashing. COVID exposed the system in the healthcare system that has crashed, and we experienced it firsthand. We saw people getting to hospitals and not getting care. We saw the disabled and people battling with disabilities not getting adequate care just because they're disabled. They were treated completely different at medical facilities. But what we also saw is that there's a number of doctors, nurses, medics, volunteers who came together and against all odds put their lives at risk and did a lot to help the individual communities. We saw volunteer undertakers that help us with our Muslim funerals come out in their numbers and assist us with funerals. In our Muslim culture, we bury people very quickly, and we knew that would be a challenge. And while we were dealing with a lot of death and hospitals, and we also saw life. We also saw people come to families' assistance at a time where those families needed help the most, at a time where they were not supported by their own families, not because they didn't have a support structure around them, but because they family members were infected. So as much as we or the media or us as society will notice and mark the inequality and the negatives, there is also things that we need to hold on to and look at how we can continue to mobilize and build on that mobilization, volunteerism, active citizenship, to get things done. We can't continue to rely on government. We know that. And I always tell some of the volunteers that we work with, it's not our place to keep on pointing fingers. Yes, we need to hold the state accountable. We need to stand firm against corruption. But we as active citizens in this country, we need to use our resources. We need to use our volunteers. We need to use our businesses. We need to use our platforms to make South Africa a better country for all. It's one thing to basically look at all the issues and point fingers, but by partnering with government, we are able to affect more change. And some of the work that we've done clearly demonstrates that. We were genuinely overwhelmed by some of the impact and the ripple effects by the communities. We took blueprints of our vaccination, and now it's becoming, and now we're seeing a number of pop-up vaccination sites come all over the country. People want to get vaccinated, and those that are vaccinated want to now assist others in getting vaccinated. And I think that's the important thing. We need to the challenges that the Department of Health has, we know they might not get to everyone as quick as possible. And without partnerships, we know that we can then assist them and mobilize communities. So I'm very happy that everyone drew, or the previous panelists drew the parallels with apartheid and poverty. But I think public solidarity and sustainable radical reform is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Yassine, for those opening remarks. And the point that caught my interest is on, maybe we'll address it later, is on the partnering with government. You say that's the only way we can effect change. I'd like to hear more on that at a later stage. And just to say, my thoughts were that the two other panelists were not so much drawing parallels, but showing how one is the progeny of the other. And what preceded before is part of why we're in the situation that we're in. With that being said, I wanted to know if, after hearing each other's opening remarks, if there's anything that comes up that emerges for you that you'd like to put in the space. I think Gloria would like to go. You're on mute.
Sorry, Lando, I didn't hear you.
No, I was saying that having heard each other's opening remarks, is there anything that came up for you, any fresh thinking that you'd like to put in the space?
It's quite an interesting thing, the presentation by David and that ladder, because it starts to get into the specifics of some of those things that we have to change systemically as well, trying to reverse whatever. And then Yassine stressing on the issue of solidarity, of what we can do without necessarily, of course, holding government accountable, but not hang on to that. Do what we have to do on our side. I think that I can't agree more with that, those kinds of comments.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Yassine and David, is there anything from your fellow panelists' opening remarks that caught your attention?
Yeah, so my comment about apartheid, just to put it into perspective, we know, and we hold on, and South Africans generally are very proud of the transition that we went from an apartheid state, and we hold on to the activism that took place during the apartheid that took South Africa from an apartheid state to a free democratic country, and we hold on to the transformation that happened, but we don't realize that now more than ever we need that activism so that we can continue bettering the lives of residents in South Africa. There's still immense challenges. Some people, and we have to be realistic, some people are living in worst of conditions. If you look at some of the conditions that some people are living in, and the access to healthcare, the access to housing, the access to clean drinking water, as simple as that. We've still got challenges, and we still need activism. Now more than ever, we need activism. And the protest, to me, is we've moved from apartheid, moved into a democratic country. We're moving forward, and then the 2010 World Cup takes place, and we move forward again. And internationally, we are proud of our country, and we all learn the national anthem. And it almost seems as if we're not at a point now where we're standing still, but we're at a point where we now took 2 steps back. So my using the phrase of apartheid and relating this to apartheid, now more than ever, we still need that activism. We still need people. And out of those challenges, we had activists that came out that changed the world, not just South Africa. We need that now more than ever. Our youth need that to take it. Our youth need that to take our institutions forward.
I guess that's the paradox of freedom, right? It doesn't mean that the work is done. The paradox of freedom is that it requires even more vigilance and more work. So I'm completely in agreement. David, is there anything that came up for you? If not, I'm happy to proceed.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Yasin, and it's it's a story that has been recounted, I think, to all of us over and over again over the last year. It's just the incredible assets, the wealth of expertise, the effort that is distributed through our communities, the social capital that is there and that is organized into civil society. And I guess in tying it back to the question at hand, the question is how do we ensure that civil society, which in a way is a custodian of and co-custodian of innovation and of building solidarity and of generating hope, how do we ensure that those elements of civil society are given equal value to some of the hard money that, for example, a business is able to put on the table? And how do we use a disaster like we're going through now to allow for both an assertion of the value of civil society in bringing those hard, soft aspects of transformation to the table, but secondly, create a new social contract where government, business, and civil society are seen as equal partners. And I think it's really important that we do that. When the president had to make the first announcements and where structures were set up, inevitably a government turned to its primary partner, business, and that was inevitable because of both the skills and the financial muscle that is there. It really was only afterwards that civil society was harnessed quite quickly when they realized that there wasn't that same ability to get into the rural communities, to get into informal settlements, etc. But let's use this sort of concertina of insights that has come through this disaster to try and forge a new social contract where all three are seen as equal partners.
Thank you so much, David. And just to say, part of what drew me to this discussion, why I wanted to be in conversation with the three of you, is that since July, this would be my first conversation with fellow South Africans who are doing work on the ground, who intimately know what's been happening. And for me, I'm hoping to get some catharsis, some understanding of what truly happened. And where I'd like to start is with this quote, and I'd like to get your reaction from it. The lift was not working because of the fire. So I frantically ran down the stairs with my baby. However, I was unable to get to the ground floor as the area was blocked. I managed to squeeze through to a balcony area on the second floor where I appealed to passers-by for help. All I could think was to make sure my baby lived. Firefighters arrived at the scene about 20 minutes after the people in the crowd had started rescuing other residents with ladders. which is when I was reunited with my daughter. All I could do was trust complete strangers. As you may have guessed, that is Miss Naledi Manyoni, who had to throw her baby over the balcony in that famous picture that we saw. And I guess part of hoping that you will help me is, what were the events of July? How do you name them? How are you going to record them? How will history name them? Because we've sort of alluded to looting, protest, but what was it exactly? Was it a turning point, or was it part of the sporadic uprisings that we see in South Africa due to service delivery? Was it an insurrection? What was it? And as part of that question is that in this time of COVID-19 colliding with what happened in July, in terms of the work that you do, who felt your presence? Who felt the presence and the impact of the work that you do? And who do you wish had felt your presence in terms of broadening the work that you do? So I will just put that out there, and whoever feels moved to help me understand what happened, I would be so grateful.
Let me start, Lwando. I think part of the reason we keep referring to the apartheid time is, for example, we know what it means to be deliberately deprived of infrastructure of all sorts. No schools, no clinics, no centers of service, none of all of that, right? And we know and we have lived through that. And so this reminds me of, I went to Oxford because my cousin was there. In the library at Oxford, there is an oath you make before you go in there. I can't remember the wording, but the whole thing is about, I will not destroy this book. It's like a person. You make an oath that I will not kill none of the literature that is here. What I'm saying, Lwando, is that once you do appreciate what it means to be without any of these things, and deliberately so, the last thing in your mind is to trash the little bit that's in front of you. And so it becomes your DNA, and you're active in different ways, but not that way. So for me, that was a horror story, that in the midst of this, the people who are the most troubled are now without help. And so I'm going to come to the Solidarity Fund later and the Relief Fund, not now. But our response to these communities is an interesting one, because you have to first deal with the destruction of the soul first. People are traumatized, they're hungry as well, and they have no access to nothing. That if you were the person before this destruction, you will probably understand what you have done now. I don't even think that the people who were there can do it again. Now that they see what it means, people have to travel 150 kilometers just to get a loaf of bread. How heartless can that be? High blood pressure, ARVs, you name it. People have got to do all manner of things to have access to those things. That is heartless. And so we keep referring to this period where there was a deliberate exclusion and deprivation, to a time where you think some things have been done. Now you are where you are. You've got to, you cannot destroy the little bit that is actually there. But let me end there, because there are other panelists. One can talk about who are you in the solution, but mainly Lwando, is that I would like somebody to explain to me how useful it was to destroy all of that infrastructure. What is it that we are not seeing that they see, and where are we with it at this point?
You know, I think, just to be provocative, there are some people who would say there was some usefulness, but I'll leave it there and just check with David or Yassine if there's anything that's come up for them. David?
Well, just to respond to your question, and I mean, just again, it's yet another observer view, and we all have our views, but I think that crisis does make us see things more clearly, and I think that we all saw the deep divides in our society more clearly, precipitated by COVID. It wasn't only the wealthy whose eyes opened to a greater extent to the degree of social marginalization that persists in our country. It was also those who marginalized, for whom marginalization had become normal, but were now pushed over the edge by the fact that there was a precipitous loss of money or loss of access, even, if I may say, to liquor and some of the other elements of life that have become so much part of what is normal in our society. So a clarity of looking into that deep, deep, deep divide. And it carried on and it carried on until a tipping point. And it was probably triggered, it was probably precipitated. But the surveys that have been done in the NIDSCRAM survey and the surveys by the University of Johannesburg and others have been really, really helpful to have a finger on the pulse of what's happening. And for me, one of the most frightening findings from the NIDSCRAM surveys was the fact that only 35% of South Africans say that they have got social trust. A whole lot of measures of social trust and an index of social trust. Only 35% fall into the high category in terms of social trust. So we have a society that remains fractured, that those divides remain, and we are going to have, we are going to continue to have to look into those divides, and sometimes there are going to be explosions that emerge through those divides until we truly find a process of healing them.
Yassine, was there any usefulness in terms of what happened in July? Can there be any usefulness in the destruction of property in the way that you saw, we all witnessed?
Yeah, I think, and just to reply to David's comment now as well. I think we now were made more aware of what was happening and what the divide is. But my fear is that we've become immune to the divide. And as communities, are we just accepting that the divide is there? And only now, when it started impacting on businesses around us, did we take note of some of the challenges that we do face? And is it only because it hit certain areas, or it hit certain communities, or it became violent to that extent? Did it have to take that much that we now exposed to what the divide is? That's the question. And what are we doing to make ourselves more aware, more conscious, and more proactive, so that we continue moving forward?
And speaking of being immune to the divide and moving on to this theme of solidarity, as today's talk is about public solidarity towards radical reform. When words like hope and solidarity are raised in certain communities, eyebrows are also raised, skepticism, like, why should I do this again? I've bought into the idea of South Africa, of hope and solidarity, and it's not yielded any returns. So calls for solidarity can bring back haunting memories, deja vu, if there was ever one, of unequal gains from solidarity. There are times when I feel that there's a wide gulf between the words that we use to describe ourselves as South Africans, as Yassine has alluded to, and who we are in reality. And I guess you've alluded to this in your opening remarks, but I'm hoping that you can just share a little bit more from your observations, from your experiences as to what separates South Africans, because that is our hindrance towards public solidarity, what militates against social cohesion and human solidarity at these times. And also, how do we act across difference? I know those are 3 questions. Feel free to tackle the part that you're drawn to the most.
For me, it's a number of things. We have been so separated physically. You know, when you relate the apartheid things to young people, some of the things are very weird. They're quite sound hilarious, but real. So the physical separation of people according to how they look like means also today, even sometimes the most well-meaning person doesn't really know you as much, doesn't know your environment. The most caring person today might not be able to say, what did we do to Mkhanyakude? What exactly did we do to Ugu district as Ngolweni? Why did we go that route at Tumtuba? What is the meaning of that? And so you find that sometimes the lack of what looks like lack of solidarity is simply truly people not knowing what to do or not being even to interpret what has happened. They know that it has gone wrong, but where do we start? So, for example, somebody like me, yes, there is food crisis and you have to put food parcels in front of people, for example. But coming from where I come from, I resent that too, because that dependency issue always filters into another food parcel. And so you default to, this is the last food parcel I'm going to give. I'm going to give farm inputs now. People must go to their gardens and plant and make food for everyone. Comes another wave of, say, unrest or whatever you want to call it. People have potatoes and cabbage and spinach and tomatoes in their gardens. They have a full meal. And this is now the sustainability issue, because you know what it means to keep people in that space of being dependent on handouts. It is humiliating. Their self-esteem, their dignity is lost in this whole wash. But you have to do what you have to do, because today there's a child on the table who's crying for food. You have to bring a food parcel. So I'm just giving that as an example of in our solidarity responses, we may not look the same way of responding simply because others know more what has happened than others. But you know, has got to be said as well that South Africans are known for solidarity at the same time. People have thrown everything into the COVID. I'm talking now as the chairman of the COVID, of the Solidarity Fund. People from all walks of life, all types of people, from poor to wealthy, people threw the last cent they have towards the Solidarity Fund to counter this pandemic. And there you could not say people was different. We were all the same. Part of the reason was that COVID was not discriminating either. It was hitting from wealthy to poor, to black to white, to old and young, everywhere. Townships, suburbs, rural areas, the whole West. It was just a nightmare. So South Africans have been seen to be in solidarity. I have experienced that physically, because the kind of people who actually put everything to make it work, anti-COVID in South Africa, you will be surprised just the range of that person. Thanks, London.
Thanks. And just to say to the audience, I see all your questions coming in. I will pose them to the panelists. Keep them coming. David?
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, people people have a sense of value if we can build their sense of purpose, belonging, identity. Those are the three triggers that really shape so much of human behavior. And I think we've got to say, how do we build human value by tapping into that sense of purpose, belonging, and identity, and just some practical ways. We forget to an extent the degree to which there has been family fragmentation, family breakup, a disempowerment of families not really understanding that they can participate in building their child's brain, which is so fundamental to building child agency. And so starting to just reestablish practices, promoting practices, ensuring that wherever mothers and fathers and children interface with civil society, with government, we're giving the message that, for example, you can build your child's brain simply by reading or telling stories or showing pictures to your child, starting to create that sort of engagement between parent and child seems to be so vague, but it's so fundamental to building, to reestablishing the love and preventing the hurt that I spoke about. But that then needs to follow through into our structures, which are harsh places, our schools. There are some fantastic teachers across, but we still have very much a discipline-driven approach to education in the country. We haven't taken on board the scientific research that says that learning happens through your emotions. Learning happens when children feel safe, secure, supported in schools. And so a transformation of the curriculum of education is fundamentally required, that places as much focus on the emotional well-being as the child as the content that they're getting. And that means that teachers have to feel motivated. They can't feel that they're in a hierarchy that is alienating and pushing them to the bottom. And the same applies in the health sector and in many other social sectors as well. So what I'm saying is, I think that there's psychological elements, there are structural, institutional changes that need to be made. And then finally, we're not living in 1994 now. We now have a range of other instruments that are at our disposal to begin to bridge some of these divides. And one of them that is in the hand of most people is a cell phone. Yet people can't afford data, so they can't get access to the basic information, the basic applications that others do. And I think what the disaster regulations have shown, with the zero rating of public benefit organizations, requiring network operators to expand data access, has meant that a lot of people that have formerly been excluded from socioeconomic development applications have been included. So I think we have to be innovative, even as we're seeking to redress the problems of our past.
And Yassine, having heard all of that, and back to my question, what separates us and how do we act across the divide and difference?
So I think David rightly says there has to be this fundamental address. It's important that we change the mindset. I see a comment on the chat that how can't we hold government accountable? And to answer your question as well, it's not holding government accountable. I think the important thing is we have to hold a government accountable. But holding government accountable is not activism. Holding government accountable is not being an active citizen, and that's it. We need to use the channels like the media and the institutions to hold government accountable and ensure that we stand up and face corruption and be vocal about facing corruption. But that's not where it stops. For us to take South Africa forward, it is our equal responsibility to do what we can do to fill that gap, to make sure that we are able to serve out, not just in our communities, but serve our communities at large in ways that are innovative and that are sustainable. Gloria made a very, very important point about the dignity of people. And she rightly mentioned that handing a food parcel is not dignity. And that's probably the biggest challenge, because we know that a hungry man is an angry man. You can't give hope to a person that's very, very hungry. And on the other hand, you don't want to create an environment where there's no dignity, or a person becomes too dependent on a food hamper that he's getting. So that's where we are at the moment. What sort of interventions do we do, or do we have to create so that we can better the lives of the people, and they can and something that they can sustain. Very often we look at and NPOs will address projects where we will look at how can we sustain the project. I think the difference comes in is what sort of interventions can we get involved in where the public or the benefactor can then sustain himself. And that's how we need to start addressing. This is the fundamental mindset and the awareness that we need to start creating. Specifically around government and holding them accountable. Yes, again, I'll say we need to hold them accountable, but at times by partnering with government in ways where we can better their lives. It doesn't make sense for NPOs to go into areas with food hampers and hand out food hampers. There's better ways or more sustainable ways where we partner and we are able then to create sustainable projects so that people's lives can be also there's a lot of duplication in NPOs working in certain areas. There's a lot of COVID has showed us that resources is scarce. We know that the health sector, for example, there were certain hospitals that received PPE, received funds for PPE, and private patients were paying for the PPE, whereas there was other hospitals that didn't have PPE at all. So I think that's when I spoke about partnerships. I think that's where to get more bang for our buck and to use our resources optimally. We need to look at partnerships not only with government, partnerships with other NPOs. We need to use our resources, volunteers. We need to use infrastructure and skills more than ever. I think apartheid has showed us that. I mean, apartheid, COVID, the protests. I think all these challenges have showed us that we need to use one another and draw on one another's resources so that we can work together to make our communities better for one another, of course.
Thank you so much, Yassine. And I guess you're leading up to themes that I wanted to cover in terms of what solidarity looks like within the non-governmental sector space. What are the challenges? And I think you've mentioned some of them in terms of duplication and all of that. And also this idea of public-private partnerships. I just wanted to get that a little bit clear. But just to say, from my attorney's perspective, is that it feels like, in answering my own question and in thinking about my own question, that this idea of an incomplete transitional justice process, where a lot of themes in terms of the fallout from apartheid, whether it's justice, reparations, reconciliation, all those themes were kind of left half-baked, in my opinion. And I think those things will always fester underneath some of the incidents that we see, whether it's the pandemic or the July riots, because even in the events of July, we heard people bring up former apartheid presidents and saying, what about him, you know? So I think those things for me are what keeps us divided fundamentally, including all the issues that you've highlighted. I want to move on, but before I do, I think Solo wants to come in and I'm happy to give him the floor.
Thank you very much. This has really been stimulating, and I'm reluctantly just making a couple observations. And I, listening to Gloria Seroba, I always think we need to have that mindset that says, how do we make sure that we give back dignity that's been stolen every day? And part of that theft of for lack of a better word, of that dignity, comes with how we've treated people just after apartheid, and people feel that they are betrayed daily. So a sense of betrayal of what I was expecting, and it's yet another deferred dream. It's a deferred dream, not just for me, but for my children too. So 3 things that I thought I should just bring forward, in addition to this question of dignity, is the question that Mesrobe asked about destroying the little you have. We've been traveling around. We spent time in KZN 2 weeks ago with the team, and it was heartbreaking to see how that little that used to sustain the very community was then just flattened, like there's nothing that, and now people have to travel further. Where in Mpendle, for example, where we went, now people have to travel further to access services that were just here. Very close, they could walk. Now it's a taxi or 2 to go access the services that were there. How do you explain that? But the second part of it is also how we need to be rebuilding that sense of self. A broken trust that leads to a fragmented society, where the trust between neighbors, a neighbor who had a job, and today I don't have, but I can see that you were one of the looters. How do I forgive you? And I think if we are to take this discussion further, we should also be looking at how do we rebuild that broken trust and a sense of betrayal, neighbor to neighbor. How do I deal with my alienation as one who is unemployed and who's been unemployed for so long? And I feel that I don't belong. The small that's here, it's here, but it's not mine. And I want to give you a tangible example of this. We went to Soweto, and we had an unfortunate incident happen where one of the colleagues we were working with gets a call to say their relative has just gotten so ill. They go there, the person passes on when we were at the hospital. While waiting there, we then hear that the hospital, this is a private hospital in Soweto. Now, across the street, there are people who are unemployed. I asked the question, I wonder how I would feel if I lived so close to this hospital, and when I am in greatest need, I'm told I can't be admitted because I can't pay some amount as a down payment. This is my neighbor, virtually. The hospital is my neighbor, yet it can't help me at a time of greatest need. So the question of alienation is also important. How do we deal with that sense of not belonging? The things that are close to me, but they don't belong to me. They are alien to me, and they don't serve me. And how do we then just fix those societies? Phoenix being another one. How do you fix those communities in Phoenix? That sense of reconciliation that Luanda was talking about, reconciliation and forgiveness. The TRC reloaded, in other words. How do we make sure that unfinished business continues to then be healed? And you then don't paper over it. Marikana is a good example. Now we are talking about what do we do about reparations for those families. So I think we should make it as practical as possible, as these panelists have been saying, and to the audience I'm pleading, let's try and delve into those areas where it's a sore point for us as a nation. Thanks, Os.
Thank you, Solo. I mean, those are such fundamental nation building questions. You know, how do we repair? It's easy to destroy, but how do we repair? How do you build trust? And I think that when it comes to, again, the law profession, everything is underpinned by a sense of precedent. You know, let's look at when it happened before and how did we deal with it? And when we look into our past to search for answers, there hasn't been that one occasion where we can say all those ingredients can work today, in that we can take a little bit of the past, take what was incompleted and infuse it with today's wisdom. But also just to say that part of the despair, the indignity, and the ruins that people are now living with, they did not just come up during COVID. We had 10 years of institutions being hollowed, of state capture, of corruption and the loss of funds. So for me, if I had to, respond to Selo, not as a panelist, but just to hand it over to the other panelists, is that until government can show me that there's a reason to trust in them again, I think I'm always going to have a sense of fragility. Yep. That all this hard work that we're doing could be ruined by a reckless government. So I think that, as Yassine pointed out, to do this alone as non-governmental actors is but half the job. So I'll just leave it there and just hand it over to the three panelists, and David unmuted himself first, so he gets to go.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and we've got to be careful that in trying to process the human psyche to such an extent, we don't end up atomizing this challenge to a large extent and making it just about communities that need to take responsibility, that need to be healed. That's got to happen within an effective leadership and governance framework. And so back to your question, what is it that led people to destroy the little bit that they had? And if there's not leadership, if there's not effective government, and that includes effective government around safety and security, if that's not in place, we certainly can't. There's no way that we can appeal to a sense of responsibility and a sense of discipline of the ordinary citizen. The two have to come together. But I've also sort of puzzled over this issue, Gloria, of why this rampant destruction, and I've tried to explain it a little bit in terms of sort of people consumed by the moment. But it is also useful just to fully understand the power of emotion and the power of anguish and anger, and how that overrides rationality. And to go back to my example of the education system and children, we know so well that children who are subject to an environment of stress at home because they don't get enough food, or because their families are fractured, who then come into a school environment, and that stress is only compounded because there's a teacher who's intimidating or threatening to them. What it does is it switches off the logical mind. It releases neurotransmitters that actually prevent rationality, prevent learning from happening. And I think we saw this. I mean, you can call it the mass. You can call it the mass psychology, but where this upwelling of anguish and anger in the absence of the governance frameworks that we've spoke about led to a dissociation, a public dissociation from the future, from the communities, and really resulted in a free for all, and people primarily concerned for themselves, and totally setting aside community and other issues of social capital. So what do we need to do about it? Well, and to come back to Selo's point, the first thing is that I think we've got to find language that recognizes the invisibility of people. People don't feel like they're seen. They feel that they've been empty promises. This is the language that people use, and we have to acknowledge that. And we've seen some of the back and forth about characterizing looters, in terms that are incredibly disparaging. I don't think that's helpful as we find our way forward. And that's not to say that we mustn't be prosecuting people who committed crimes, but we do need to recognize some of the psychology behind it. That's the starting point. There's got to be a language that is franker and honester than we have. Is there a word like that? More honest than we've ever been before. And then secondly, I think we do need to galvanize and work together in even more intense ways to harness the local social capital, to harness the local networks, the incredibly rich network of community-based organizations across the country, supported by larger non-government organizations, supported by local private and other sector and others, and use this as an opportunity to demonstrate these networks of solidarity in ways that have not happened before. And I think that can be done if we have a clarity of message, we have clear communication, we have a specific call to action, we have a new language, and we find ways to support the connectedness between these various sectors. I think that will go some way to addressing some of the fractures and fragmentation that people feel at the moment.
Thank you so much, David. You know, beyond even acknowledgement is the sense that people just want the results. They want the job. You know, they want the thing that they've been fighting for, and not this life of always begging for, you know, essential services, quality essential services. So I think that part of the fatigue is, you know, we're clawing up this hill, but are we seeing anything? You know, is there anything on the horizon? And I think that, you know, the desperation to me felt like we need this now. Not another grant, but I want a job. I've been out of work. I have an education. The things on your ladder, I've had those things, but the scaffolding hasn't led to the life that I've been promised. I've done my part. You know, I went to school. I'm good to others, but there's nothing to show for that. So I'll just leave it there and say to Gloria and Yassine, and just to say, you know, we have some very amazing comments from the audience, and I'll read one of them in case it sparks something as you respond to Selo. So Shirley Walter says, Neville Alexander was clear that it was imperative to challenge racial categories, apartheid geography as basic strategies to challenge the enforced separation. Do you have ideas as to how we can make these two structural moves to signal connection and interdependence as opposed to separation? So I'll just put Shirley's voice into the mix, and with everything that Selo has said and David, Gloria, Yassine, what is your freshest thinking? I see that Gloria's mic is unmuted.
Thank you very much, Luando. To be honest, this conversation should be longer. It's quite lots to talk about. When we speak about rebuilding the broken trust, it is a massive program, because if I can just give an example, we're watching the state capture now, and we're all horrified by what's going on there. When you actually put on the table the impact of it, the cost, the massive cost that came with that state capture, is again, you want to say, who are these people? I mean, really, we were not always like this. Even if we had nothing to steal then, but this is the kind of people now, we've got them now, they are in our system. And what do we do with this? 1994, the whole world was behind South Africa. Even as we inherited South Africa, which was a junk status, such that we are an uninvestable country. But the whole world was behind us, ready to throw everything to make it work. And therefore, it took a lot of attention to detail to reverse that and put South Africa back into an investable grade. It took 7 years to get it there, up to 2001. And now we feel relief. At least we are like anyone else. We're competing for capital from all over the world. We're competing against other destinations. We look decent now, and all those details have been dealt. Only to now say 2019, partly because of the state capture and everything else that comes with it, we are in a junk status again. And this time, we are all by ourselves. We are all on our own because the world has moved. The world is dealing with other things now. We have to again painstakingly undo this, now this time all by ourselves. And of course, while we're still looking at that, you are hit by COVID, you are hit by this unrest thing. It's like just a hopeless kind of thing. But the only thing I can say, Luando, is that South Africans know when they are in trouble, and they do respond. Even in this case, South Africans have responded, and South Africans are doing their bit to undo some of these unnecessary distractions that it's just that one wants to calmly communicate to everybody that when you do A, this is the result. When you do this, this is the cost. And some of these distractions we may not be able to reverse. So when we speak about broken trust, having to rebuild again, you are talking to a wounded person this time. And it's going to take us a lot and a lot. People are psychologically broken, people are traumatized, people are fearful. And so those first few days of those people in KZN, hopelessly looking there and no police to be found. What kind of conversation do you have with this kind of person? And how do we even explain it as a country? And all you have is yourself and so on and so on. So we must not be casual about the damage of the July event. We have broken people's hearts completely. And we have to deal it heavy lift. We have to heavy lift this thing because it's not just a case of I've lost infrastructure, I've lost food. It's about the souls are broken. And there's a big, big, big program that needs to follow that.
I remember Madiba once said we need the RDP of the soul. Perhaps it's time to revisit that. And Yassine, just to say, what sparked the Arab Spring was a young man who was unable to find a job, setting himself alight. So we are destroying property. My fear is we're getting to a level of frustration where we set ourselves, our bodies on fire because we've tried all forms of other language and this is the one that's left. And in light of that desperation and the huge amount of work that non-governmental actors have to do, I imagine that there are limits to what non-governmental actors can do outside of government. And I'm just saying this because I want to bring in a question by Sumaya. I'm not sure if it's our Sumaya, but she says, do you think the NGO sector, private individuals could play a role in housing provisioning? And I know housing provisioning is not your area, but just to make a tenuous link to something that is in your area is vaccination. And part of the public solidarity that's needed right now is around vaccination. And we're seeing a lot of doubt and mistrust. Do you think that the broken trust that Selo was talking about, that all of you have alluded to, is the reason why there is this doubt that historically we haven't had in South Africa when it comes to taking action of this kind, like taking a vaccine? Or am I mistaken? I know that was a mouthful, but I'm hoping you can grab onto something there.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm hearing words of like hope and trust. And can we trust our government if we can't hold them accountable and healing the wounds? I think the one thing, and Gloria mentioned it, that COVID and the rest of the world is going on with their challenges. There is no way we're going to be pitied or bailed out because everyone's going through challenges. And as long as the challenges remain, we need to acknowledge that there's a lot of people that still need a lot of resources, and we can't rely on the international support like we did with the other challenges that we had, or the other challenges that were in the past. In this realization that there's a lot of people that are dealing with anger and mistrust and wounds that are not healed. Is there perhaps a gap of leadership at grassroots level? Is there a need for community leaders, religious leaders, to start galvanizing and bringing communities and society together? And I think that's where we've taken so many steps back. It's important that those that have been lucky enough and those that have overcome the challenges of the past and they take on that responsibility to assist those and uplift the lives of those that don't have. And until we don't change that mindset at grassroots level, on the ground, in communities, there's always going to be this notion that we can't trust, or we're not, there's no reconciliation, because we're holding on to leadership that's no longer with us. We're holding on to stories from 1994, and we're hoping that that will galvanize us. But we need to start inculcating a culture of the next Madiba and the next Tutu and the next legacy, so that we can hold on to leadership on the ground that we trust to take us forward. And I think that's the gap that creates anger, because now we don't know who to hold on to. We don't know which direction. We don't know who to trust. We can't rely on government alone to build the trust. We can't rely on social campaigns in limited areas. It needs to be a conscious effort by all of us, like the vaccinations. None of us are protected until all of us are protected. And like that, we need to ensure that we develop not just campaigns. We need to create we need to fundamentally address the fact that it's in our hands now. We need to inculcate a culture of leadership in communities so that we can build the trust again and make our lives better.
And just, in answering Sumaya's question, is that I then take it that you believe that the NGO sector does have a role in housing provisioning and other social services, but it would be in partnership with the state.
Of course, the NPOs can go into areas and build houses, and we know that there's houses in areas where there's a lot more need. So I think anyone in any NPO that's involved in the housing sector needs to have partnerships with the government arms so that the need can be identified. All we're doing is if we're going to saturate the area where there is houses, and you've got an area just over the hill you're creating more anger if you're not addressing the urgent needs first. And not just with housing, with healthcare, with education. There's a lot of schools that are equipped and they're getting government support, and then NGOs go there, and because there's the government support and the media, and then there's a school in the next suburb, or sometimes in the same suburb, the same town or the same township, where students don't have food, don't have water, don't have uniforms or shoes. I think when we start partnering and we work with local government, when we work with our ward councillors, when we work with our local schools, our local churches, our local mosques, I think that collaboration allows us to identify the urgent needs firstly. And when we look at it at a macro level, through government, we can then identify those needs. But it's only through those partnerships. We know that the resources in certain departments are very, very stretched, if not no resources, absolutely no resources at all. Vaccination is one thing. How does government mobilize when we know that the sector, the healthcare sector, is already taking such a pounding with COVID? Without us partnering with government and creating campaigns to mobilize people so that we can get them to stations, and it's needed because we're dealing with vaccine hesitancy. If we don't have our faith-based leaders come forward, if we don't have our community leaders step up and get vocal in mobilizing small communities, we'll never be able to mobilize South Africans to get to the vaccination centers. And again, there's so many lessons that we can take just from vaccination, but partnerships is key. We have to collaborate so that we can address this at the macro level as well.
And Gloria, just to say that it's been said that the Solidarity Fund could be used as a model for future public-private partnerships to tackle big societal challenges, such as food insecurity, which David really did touch on, and gender-based violence. For people who are not, aware of what this model is, what are some of the lessons you would share on this platform as to what has made that work or made it the model to follow?
Lando, I think the boring part of it is what people don't want to get involved with, because it starts with the donors who are keen and anxious to put money behind you. Must be assured that the money ends up where they had meant it to go. And that means those uninteresting things about the governance, the reporting, the systems, the segregation of duties. It's a horror story to steal money which is meant for PPEs. Meantime, people are dying in hospitals without PPEs. You have to think that way. So this thing about governance and controls and whatever is what we have emphasized on. And you use just about every system there is behind you. In our case, we had Anderson Young, we had Edward Nathan, we had Pricewaterhouse. You can name all the institutions whose job is just to secure the internal controls to help us. That is our biggest give to the country. And then the second thing was the people did not only just give money, they gave off themselves, of their companies. We had at some stage over 400 people working for the fund, and we're not paying for that. They were seconded and given by people. When I'm saying people actually gave a lot, it is to that extent. All our legal agreements were done pro bono by Edward Nathan. If I had to price that, it's mind-boggling. Well, you're a lawyer, you understand, right? And because they have to be tough and strong, because at the end of the year, Pricewaterhouse is waiting to do this audit. Typically, for example, our audit is being done and reviewed by the Pricewaterhouse office in London. You know why? It's pro bono on the one hand, but secondly, it is high stakes for Pricewaterhouse. If it so happened that that audit is not properly done, it is high profile, they have to do it as if they are being paid for, time overruns and all that. So we actually did that with ease. And so when it came to implementation, we never struggled with finding people to help us. Where, for example, we have to get high care equipment for hospital ABC. We are not designed for that, but Spire under the FNB group, they do that very well. Then you have, so I'm just saying we, hence, when the president now looked at this whole thing of the Human Relief Fund for KZN and Gauteng now, boom, he places that on our hands as well. So we're running almost two funds now. One to deal with the unrest specifically, and one still dealing with the COVID and everything that comes with it. And then the partnerships are very important. David is a partner in some aspect of it. You look for the people who know that area very well. Don't restart the process and just go. But in that, there's a huge element of trust, because behind that, or in front of that, is the name of the Solidarity Fund. We have to be partnering with people who mean well and who can actually give the capacity that is required. You know why? Because it is called a crisis fund. Somebody is dying tomorrow while you are twitching your thumbs and you are being all over the place and whatever. So we could balance this thing of being a crisis fund, agile, flexible, and so on. We could balance that at the same time with strong governance. The fact that you have to respond quick doesn't mean that you skip those steps of segregation of duties. It's not the same person who signed checks, who ordered something. Make sure all of those things are actually in place. So I can only say that the issue here, and this is a one-time Rwanda where government partnered meaningfully with private sector. And they still do that, even with the human relief fund issues. Government is working very closely with private sector. Issue here is that the issues are very big and there is no time to be point scoring and calling each other names. The stakes are high and distraction has happened. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that the Solidarity Fund should actually be a business school case study if it's not already. David, I know that you wanted to go back to that question by Shirley Walters on how do we move towards connection and interdependence as opposed to separation, especially since we're a geographically, spatially disconnected country.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I just following the chats, and it's obviously a critical challenge. The spatial patterns of apartheid that persist, that are so hard to overcome. So to speak to that first, and I don't have easy answers, but I did say that certainly what we have to use is the technology and the tools at our disposal, and we certainly have not used digital technology to the fullest. We've certainly, we've put hardware in schools and it's been stolen. We haven't fully used the ability of people to use cell phones in their own hands and to make sure that that they have adequate to sufficient data to do that. So I'd suggest, and we're talking about crisis and we're talking about now, that would be something that is within our hands. Secondly, we need to learn from countries such as Switzerland and Germany that are now requiring that in any new developments, up to 20% of the housing gets dedicated to what they call subsidized or vulnerable families, single parent families. That varies from country to country. But we have to start finding ways to create opportunities for spatial integration in ways that we haven't before. But the comment I'd like to make is around how we deal with racial categories and the racial tensions that we saw arose even in the violence, the events in Phoenix. And if we're thinking radically and if we're thinking honestly, I think that it's appropriate at this forum to say that we need to collapse the subcategories of Black that we have now, Indian, colored, and Black African, because they don't have predictive value, even for Black economic empowerment. At an individual level, they no longer have predictive value. We know that from the inequality studies. Certainly at a group level, we can still identify a differential between Black African and colored and Indian. But when you're looking at two people, no longer do those categories have predictive value. And I think that if we're trying to move towards a society where we're not racially categorized, we can no longer accommodate categorization that does not make sense, especially when it potentially is contributing to keeping people apart. What does still have predictive value is the categorization between white and Black. And here, for reasons of redress, we have to sustain those distinctions, even as we try and address the issues of bringing together white and black in ways that we haven't before. And this requires, and I do believe that we have not fully gone through this process. It still requires a process of confrontation and dealing with white privilege, the sort of entitlement of wealth that I spoke about earlier. That does require a harder conversation than we've had up to now. And I think that if that can be our approach, to be as hard-nosed and as pragmatic as we can, even as we're dealing with these hard, soft aspects, I think that potentially is one of the quantum leaps forward in South Africa.
Thank you so much, David. Just because we're running out of time, I just want to get to Solo because we have a question from an anonymous audience member who says, or he or she says, what does the foundation think about David's proposal about regulation and limiting the damage of the liquor industry?
Sure. You know, those who know that I don't drink, they're going to think, how can you ask a guy like that a question about the liquor industry? Obviously, he's going to say, ban it, ban it. No, but on a serious note, you know, when we were in Pietermaritzburg, we went with Hulamin there, and they took us around, showed us the damage that was done. And Mr. Robert mentioned something that's important to note, that for those days of the SAPS, of authority not responding, people had been taking alcohol out of the SAB and drinking it straight outside the SAB, waiting for transport to pick them up over days, 2 days, and there was silence. And in addition to that, we understand that some people drowned in the river that's crossing just opposite the SAB. I'm not drawing any conclusions about the drowning and the alcohol consumption, because it could have been many reasons why that is. But it tells you that our society, the damage that we've been talking about, part of the damage was also for the apartheid government to build those township bars at the beginning, right at the entrance of the township. And that's what David is, I'm hearing David to be talking about, dealing with the damage that was caused even by infrastructure that was planted intentionally to cause damage, paralysis of the mind. And I think if we are to do anything to undo that, the unfinished business starts with also having honest conversations about the damage caused by alcohol in the liquor industry.
Thank you so much, Salo. It is indeed, you know, it's not that complicated personally for me in terms of how I view alcohol. We probably have the same views, but I can imagine that kind of control will make a lot of people nervous because it can lead to other measures of control. But with that being said, as we wrap up this conversation, I just want to shout out our audience members who submitted questions, and some of them we've gotten to and others we haven't. I apologize to those whose questions have not been answered, but I want to say that we see you, we see your questions, and we appreciate them. So a shout out to Smobile, Sumeya, Sherry Walters, Mbusiswa, Mary Burton, Pilile Dlamini, Anastasia Machobane. Yeah, I think that is all of them. Again, thank you so much. And perhaps to wrap up, as part of the concept document that was prepared by the NMF, it came with this beautiful quote at the top, which goes, "The sleeping giant is one name for the public. When it wakes up, when we wake up, we are no longer only the public. We are civil society, the superpower whose nonviolent means are sometimes for a shining moment more powerful than violence, more powerful than regimes and armies. We write history with our feet and with our presence and our collective voice and vision." I'd like to say that that quote to me signifies all the panelists that we have, the NMF and the work that you do, all the ordinary South Africans that actually did write history with their feet and their presence the last couple of months. And as we wrap up, I guess I want to pose the question of radical reform. If we could take one step, one giant step towards radical reform, what in your eyes and from your experience and your assessment of what is needed right now, what would be radical? Radical hope. What would be radical? What would be miraculous? I know that we are a country that does not like the word miracle, but to me, from the teachings of so many people, a miracle is just changing your perception. It sounds easy, but it's just deciding that you're going to change your perception and think differently. So as we close, as we have people listening to you who want to take away something from this conversation, from the work that you do, from what you have seen, and how it can apply to their lives, what is radical? What does radical reform look like? And perhaps in the last year and a half, you've seen a glimpse of the radical, and perhaps you can share an anecdote of what radical looks like and who a radical person is in that context. To me, you represent the radical. I'll let that marinate. I love silence because we can take our time with it.
Rwanda, I'm happy to come in if
Sure.
Shall I do that? So I think we've tried to weave a bit of a complex narrative today, a narrative of the benefits of freedom, of the deprivations of apartheid that were so fundamentally fundamentally changed by that moment of freedom, yet an acknowledgement that so many shackles of the past remain. And that is a complex message to convey. It's a complex message to convey that the tremendous capacity and the tremendous social assets that are found across the country, across every sector, that are located in local communities, is a network, a social fabric that is holding our country together, despite the many challenges that we face. And we must celebrate and we must build on that. And so we're not starting from scratch. We're not starting from a deep hole. We are starting from a scaffold that is there, but has got big gaps. And so I think as we think about as we think about what we've done right and what we've done wrong, it's not as if we're wanting to hark back to the past at all. What concerns us are the missed opportunities. What concerns us is the fact that we could be further down the line than we already now. And I think that it's incumbent on us to acknowledge that we have not done justice to the Madiba generation of children that have grown up, that we've not enabled them to live the promise that was there in 1994. And I think it's incumbent on us now not to make the same mistake for their children who are growing up now 27 years later. And so the radical reform that I think that is needed is for us to truly put children at the center of our development efforts going forward. And if we do that, we'll start to carve the pathway to growth and development. We'll start to create pathways for real and imminent possibility that ultimately will overcome many of the disparities and the divides that we experience now.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. Yassine?
Yeah, just to echo what David said, I think education, but again, I think the radical starts with us. We need to be radical in ensuring that we put ourselves up, and despite the trust or the challenges that we know is immense, I think we need to put ourselves forward. We need to never forget the power of collaboration between corporate and the private and government partnerships, and we need to use that to galvanize the scaffold that David spoke about. And it's only through these partnerships and this galvanizing that we can inculcate, and it's what we do radical now that will inculcate a culture of leadership. And we hope that legacy and that leadership, like in the past, will benefit our youth in the years to come. But it starts now. It starts with every one of us willing to take that radical risk and put ourselves up there and take the risk to show leadership in firstly our communities, in our homes, in our areas, in our churches, in our mosques. And like that, with the collaborations, we can then change the mindset at the macro level.
Thank you so much, Gloria.
At 62, it's very difficult to say I must be radical now. Let me try. Where I sit, Rwanda, radical for me would be to take what we call the biggest investors in any economy, that is your banks, your life companies, and your retirement funds, and put money in the rural areas. 38% of this country is blocked out there in the rural areas, and that lot of people feels kind of abandoned, they feel neglected, and hence it is easy to just do all these things we've been talking about when you actually go there. Bring them back into a life of dignity again, and invest properly. Protect your depositors, of course, protect your policyholders, protect your beneficiaries of the retirement funds. You don't do reckless, but those systems of the banks, of the life companies, of the retirement funds must deal with this matter of investing in the rural areas as they do with other things. If you do that, you release the system in the urban areas. Most people who are there don't want to be there. They are there for the hope of a job of just being a domestic worker. If you do that, you will release that system, people go back home. Then you have a balanced kind of thing, because economic activity in the rural areas is what is required to release the system of the congestion in the urban centers and rearrange the economic formula. That would be radical.
Thank you so much. And just to say from my side, you've given up 2 hours of your day. It's deeply appreciated. And as far as I could, from my experience of the three of you, it was enriching and worth the time. So to our audience who've stuck it out with us for 2 hours, I hope you were able to take away a few gems from our panelists. And just to say, to wrap up, Mandela said that we will have to travel a difficult road before we can truly unite the majority of our people, without regard to race, color, gender, around a common patriotism, one of whose critical elements must be a caring society. We saw an abundance of care over this time of COVID and the past month. The work now is on sustaining that care and embedding it in our daily lives, in our civic lives and political lives. And I think you've all given a sense of what our priorities should be in delivering, the creation of a caring society. So thank you so much. And Selo, if you don't mind, I was supposed to do the wrap up, but since you're here, I think you're best placed to sign us out. Thank you.
Thank you.
I never know how to thank people who give their time like you have, and to the audience members who have just also been following through your questions, and we are hoping to then be able to release a statement later today about some of the thinking that came out of here. In closing, I think one could go on and just give a sense that the three of you, the four of you, I should say, gave us hope that there's something to live for, there's something to fight for, there's something worth ensuring that we make work. You gave us a sense that dignity belongs to all, including those who are alienated daily, who feel that the struggle remains real for them. But radical change starts with the leader within each one of us, that we can be the leaders, that we don't have to wait for big leadership to come forward. But that we need not do more, but do differently in order to build that society that we dream of. It starts with investing right, investing our energies in things that can help bring us that little bit of hope with, and that the dream is not deferred forever. And if we are to mark the 25th anniversary of the South African Constitution, we must say to each one of the people who are watching, the four of you are saying, each one of us can do it if we believe that it is this country's all we have, and that the young who are still to be born will find something that we didn't betray the dreams of those who fought hard. So thank you so much for all these inputs, and we hope to make you proud with the little bit that we'll do as the foundation. Thank you for so much again for the work that you put in.
And please, everyone listening, join us on the 25th of August, 3 o'clock for the annual lecture, the 19th annual lecture with Fatwa Bensouda, who is someone that I look up to as a lawyer and, you know, for the work that she's done. So hopefully we'll see you next week. So bye to our panelists, bye Selo, bye Sumaya.